Good evening. As Mike alluded, we want to continue our study in optimism versus pessimism. And, how should the Christian view the world, or how should we view our life, if you will, as a Christian? And just a quick overview, these are the things that we were discussing this morning. And I think we got down to right around the work in your church, so right around in this area right here. So we defined our terms, and then we evaluated different situations. Remember, optimism was defined as a tendency to look on the more favorable side of events or conditions and to expect the most favorable outcome. And then we also looked at synonyms to help us, because sometimes we don't use these words in everyday language, but we use other ones. So like anticipation, cheer, gratefulness, cheerfulness, positivism, idealism. Certainly those type of words are all synonyms for optimism. And then, trust, of course. And then we defined pessimism. It was the tendency to see or anticipate or emphasize only bad or undesirable outcomes, results, conditions, and problems. So it's kind of taking a negative view of life, if you will. And then we also looked at some synonyms for pessimism, and it was cynicism, depression, unhappiness, low spirits, dark side, dim view, despair. These are all synonyms that are similar in definition to pessimism. Of course, we talked about what type of view should we have towards our fellow Christians, and we looked over in 1 John, and we looked at a couple verses over there, like in 1 John 4:20, where it says, if someone says, I love God, and hates his brother, he is a liar, and he does not have love for his brother whom he has seen. How can he love God whom he has not seen? So we talked about how some brethren will take the view that, well, I can love him like a brother, but that doesn't mean that I have to like that individual. And that type of view was a pessimistic view, if you will, upon fellow Christians, and there's really it's contrary to what the Word of God would have us to do. And then we also looked at that we're not only to love our fellow Christians, but we're to love our neighbor too. And we looked at the parable of the Good Samaritan, and we talked about how the Levite and the priest had a pessimistic view towards the guy who had fallen to the wayside, whereas the Good Samaritan obviously had a positive view or a optimistic view towards that individual and took care of him. And we see that from that parable that the one who loved his neighbor was the Good Samaritan and not the priest and the Levite. And then we also talked about Mark 12 and 33, where it says, and to love him with all your heart, him being God, with all understanding, with all the soul, and with all the strength, and to love one's neighbor as oneself is more than all the whole burnt offerings and sacrifices. And we talked about all these burnt offerings and sacrifices, and how Christ counted those as naught if we just would love one another. That is far exceeding greater gift to God than what it would be for all those burnt offerings and sacrifices. So again, we should have an optimistic view towards our fellow brethren. And then we talked about our attitude towards those, how it affects those around us. That if we're negative, that our light won't shine, and that we should have an optimistic view and let our light shine before all the world. And then we also talked about how when we aren't optimistic and we view the world from that negative aspect, we come across as a hypocrite. And we looked over there at 1 John 3:18, where it says, my little children, let us not love in word or in tongue, but in deed and truth. So we need to be optimistic in the fact that we need to manifest our love, not simply state it, like we used the example of the brother who said, well, I can love him like a brother, but I don't necessarily have to like that individual. Again, that's not a manifestation of Christian love. And then we talk about hypochondriacism. You know, how some people fret over their wellness of life, if you will be, or over their health, and how that's a pessimistic look on life. And then becoming depressed over one's health or over the health of a loved one. And we looked at Romans 8:31 and Hebrews 13 and 5. I'm trying to look at my notes here. Look over there at Hebrews chapter 13. And verse 5 says, let your conduct be without covetousness. Be content with such things as you have. For he himself has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. And so if we take the spirit of that verse, we should be content with the health that we have and realize that we're only on this earth for a short period of time, and so to fret or to be overly concerned or have a pessimistic view towards oneself is not really the way that God would have us to live, and that we need to be optimistic and be able to live life to the fullest that we can be. And we talked about Brother Starr and how that he never really complained about his health, even though he was frail and whatnot, lived the age of 98, and he just said, with the affliction that I have to bear with, there'll be minor in comparison to the reward of the everlasting life that we will receive in the ever after, and that we should all have that type of onlook on life as what Brother Starr had. We talked, then we talked about 2 Corinthians 4:17, how Paul said, for our light affliction, which is but for a moment, is working for us a far more exceedingly in the eternal weight of glory. So again, that's just reiterating what we just previously said on the last slide. Then we talked about the article from Rick Liggins from Think on These Things, and how people in the church can have a pessimistic view towards the work of the church, and how that can kind of sap the life out of the church. And we took, where he said pessimism hurts the groups by seeing everything in the most negative way possible. And like during the men's meeting or whatnot, people might cite and say, we've tried that before, it didn't work, or that's too hard, we'll never be able to do that. Or the cynic hurts the group by questioning the motives of everyone else. You're just trying to get your own way, or you're just trying to put yourself forward and look good in front of everybody. And so, having that pessimistic view as a member of the local congregation, especially when it comes to furthering the gospel and sharing it with your neighbor, it can, like I say, it can suck the life out of the local congregation. And also it can hinder us from spreading that word and sowing the seed as we have been commanded, and that we should not allow that to happen, that we should actually have an optimistic view towards that. Remember that it's our job to sow the seed, and God will give the increase. So we don't have to worry about the increase. We just have to go out there and sow it. So we should have an optimistic view towards the work and spreading of the gospel, and not that one that's a negative view that would hinder us from doing that. We talked about James 4, verses 14 and 15, where it says, whereas do you not know what will happen tomorrow? For what is your life? It is even a vapor that appears for just a little time and then vanishes away. Instead, we ought to say, if the Lord wills, we shall live and do this or that. And that's kind of for those brethren that kind of say, well, we'll just leave it up to faith. We're not necessarily live life that way. James chapter 4 is talking about being presumptuous, and again, we shouldn't be presumptuous that the work won't go accordingly as we think it may not. Well, like when it comes to sharing the gospel, we again should leave that in the hand of the Lord, and the Lord will give the increase as He sees fit. And this is where we left off. So we'll continue on with our lesson here and continue on with this thought of pessimism and the growth of the church. I have up here, don't have confidence in themselves or in God. And what I mean by that is, like we, again, talking about sowing the seed. And that God will give the increase. If we have that attitude that it does no good to that it does no good. If we have the attitude that it does no good to share the gospel with someone, how is the seed of the gospel ever going to reach any type of soil out there? If we automatically condemn the soil before we even get there. So again, we need to not have that pessimistic view towards that. We really need to have an optimistic view and assume that the soil that we're casting that seed upon is fertile soil, and that it's going to germinate and God will give the increase. God knows what kind of soil it is. We do not know that, so we should not take a pessimistic view towards the spreading of the gospel. I also have up here, it says, perhaps they settle for mediocrity and complacency. When it comes to people that probably work in the workforce, when it comes to an organization, one of the worst things that can befall upon an organization is complacency. And that's usually when in the industrial world or whatnot, that's when companies begin to go under because people are complacent and they're not doing the best that they can be. And I think the same thing happens within the local church. When we just become complacent with what we have or what we've been dealt with, and we don't really get out there and work and, again, spread the gospel, we're not optimistic towards it. We take that pessimistic view, and that's really mediocrity or complacency that's settling in upon us as a congregation. And that is something that we do not want to befall upon a congregation, because when complacency starts to come in, death is just right around the corner for that organization. So I would caution you on becoming complacent as a Christian. Maybe as far as the pessimism or pessimistic individual, maybe they feel that they have gone as far as they need to go. In other words, we rest on the laurels. We've done all that in our younger years, and it either was of no avail, or we're going to leave it to the younger generation to go ahead and pick up where we left off and carry on forward. I don't see anywhere in the Bible where it allows us to rest on our laurels. I believe that we are to be just as hard-charging of a Christian from the day we become a Christian till the day we pass on this earth. So while our health may hinder us from being more as active as we once were, our spirit should be just as active as it always has been. And so, again, when our health may tend to fail or come down, it's easy to take on that pessimistic view of things, and I can attest to that. I went through that for that period of time that I was very ill and whatnot, and it's easy to allow that mindset to creep in upon oneself. So you have to be careful. Again, I think that's complacency that is at work there. The next slide here says Christians should be optimistic because I have spiritual blessings we have received. And consider Colossians chapter 3 verses 1 and 2. Over there it says, if then you were raised with Christ, see those things which are above, where Christ is, sitting at the right hand of God. Set your mind on these things above, not on the things of earth. So again, that's what we're talking about here. Tempering of the mind, reprogramming the mind, not allowing the ways of the world to encroach upon our mindset, but keeping that optimistic view as a Christian as we ought to, and having that aspect of life, just as it says here in Colossians, setting our minds on things above. As Christ said, wherever your treasures is stored, that's where your mind will be, where we need to keep our mind and our focus on heaven. And I think these things will come a lot easier. If that's not where your mind is, then you're probably going to not have as an optimistic a view as you ought to have. And then I have, if God is on our side, we need to remember that always God is on our side. And consider Philippians chapter 4, verse 13. Over there says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And that's what we need to remember when we get out there and when we're talking to our neighbor or talking to a coworker. It's not me doing this. This is Christ doing this, working through me. I'm doing this not for myself, but I'm doing it for Christ, who died for me, who hung upon the cross, so that I might have a way into heaven. And I want to share this good news with this individual so they might be partakers of that as well. That's the optimistic view that we need to keep when we go out there and are among those out in the world. Also consider Romans 8 and verse 31, where it says, when then shall we say these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? And again, in this aspect of this lesson, the person who's going to be against you, for the most part, it's going to be yourself. If you allow that pessimistic view to approach upon your mindset, it's going to be yourself. Now, granted, you can be around pessimistic people, and if you're around a lot of pessimists, you're probably going to start to live and breathe pessimism as well. So sometimes we have to be careful who we're around. But just realize, again, we need to remember that He's on our side, and that He's there championing us all the time, and it's for us to remember that. And if we can, then how can all these things befall us if God is for us? And then I also have, in teaching and attempting to convert the lost, consider 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 7. It says, so then neither he who plants is anything, nor he who waters, but God who gives the increase. Again, it's not about me, it's not about you, it's all about God. And that's who we're out there working for, that's who we're sowing for. And so when you're out there, remember, it's not about me, it's all about God. And I think that will help us to have that optimistic view that we need to when it comes to sharing the gospel. A Methodist professor, William Arthur Ward, he's quoted on his view on optimism, pessimism. This is what he's had to say. He says, optimism is a seed sown in the soil of faith. Pessimism is a seed harrowed in the vault of doubt. And I think those words are very true. And we need to not doubt ourselves when we're out there sharing the gospel with those that we come in contact with. Now let's look at how our view should be on our journey through our everyday life. How should our attitudes be towards our jobs? Do we complain, or are we satisfied? Are we not satisfied with our profession? I think we've all probably talked to somebody along those lines. The person who's always complaining about the work standards, or there's always something wrong, if you will. Or there's some people that just aren't satisfied with what they've achieved in life, and they're always wanting more and more and more, thinking that one has to obtain great wealth in order to be successful. And that's kind of the American mindset. But is that really the Christian mindset? Do we strive for more because we are not satisfied? If so, consider Luke chapter 3, verse 14, where it says, "Likewise the soldier asked him, saying, And what shall we do? So he said to them, Do not intimidate anyone or accuse falsely, and be content with your wages." And so, this is Christ speaking to a soldier, but again, we are to be content with what we've been given, and not to. And I think we can. Well, back then they would intimidate, or what's that? It eludes me. That crime that when you go out there and steal from people, the mafia did it all the time. Anyways, and not embezzle, but when you threaten people, extortion, where they would use extortion to further, especially when it came to the tax collectors, they would extort people to have more wealth for themselves. I think that also holds true in our aspects of when it comes to our work. We need to be content with what we got. We don't need to extort our employers, or we don't need to be bad workers. If it's that bad, then we need to seek employment elsewhere, not be a bad employee, if you will. Again, it will be a pessimistic view that will cause you to do that. Also, what about our welfare? If you're not content with your welfare, consider Hebrews chapter 13, verse 5, where it says, "Let your conduct be without covetousness. Be content with such things as you have, for he himself said, I will never leave you nor forsake you." So again, the words there, "be content with such things as you have," is what we need to recognize from the Scriptures. So everything that we have is we are all given those things which are God's in the first place. We're just stewards of what He's given us. So He has given some more than others, but that doesn't mean that you're any less to Him than the other person. It's just the level of responsibility that we've been given. So we need to be content with those things and not let pessimism creep into our lives and tell us that we shouldn't be content with what we've been given. What about when it comes to materialism, not being content with one's house, or not being content with one's car, not being content with one's clothing? Is that really the aspect that we should have on our outlook on life? Should we have a pessimistic view towards the things that we've been given? Consider Colossians chapter 3, verse 2, where it says, "Set your mind on things above, not on the things on earth." Or Luke chapter 12, verses 22 and 23, where it says, "Then he said to his disciples, Therefore I say to you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, nor about the body, what you will put on. Life is more than food, and the body is more than clothing." And how true that is. We need to remember those things, that it's not about the material possessions that we have in life. We shouldn't have a negative view towards those things, or be not content with with what we've been given. Also, consider Titus chapter 6, verse 8, where it says, or 1 Timothy, "And having food and clothing, these things we shall be content." That's Paul says, just those two things, we should be content. It's not about it's not about the car, it's not about the house, it's not about one's job, it's not about all those things. As long as we can clothe ourselves and not be naked and have substance to eat upon, we should be content. Anything beyond that is we should be very thankful for all that we've been given, not being pessimistic and viewing, woe is me. Why, God, did you deal me this life? Why, God, did you do this to me? Woe is me. That's not the right outlook that we should have. Helen Keller is quoted in saying, "Optimism is the faith that leads to achievement." nothing can be done without hope and confidence. So we need to, I think Helen Keller's words are kind of accurate, and that we need to have hope and confidence in what we do for the Lord, and not have a pessimistic view on life, or on our congregation, or on the work that we do for the Lord. So when should we have I know I've been talking about how we need to be optimistic, and that life always should be optimistic, but is there instances in life that we should have a pessimistic view, that we should, maybe pessimism should be championed in? And I would say yes, there is some occasions, like when it comes with dealing with false prophets. Consider Matthew chapter 7 verse 15, where it says, "Beware of false prophets, who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravenous wolves." So, yeah, when we hear something that is foreign to us, we should probably have a pessimistic view, or not, definitely want to have a cautious view on those teachings, and we want to ensure that those things are in accordance with the Word of God. We need to be like the Bereans. But yes, I guess you could say that might be pessimism when it comes to false teachings. We should have it. What about when it comes to being tempted by the devil? Consider James chapter 1 verse 14. It says, "But each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and entices." So yeah, when it comes to those desires that are ungodly, and pursuing those things, we need to have a pessimistic view of those things and say, no, that's not for me. No, I'm not going to do that. No, I'm not going to go down to the local club or bar or whatever it is and hang out with my friends. That's not a good environment. That is a pessimistic view that we should have towards that type of thing. What about and also with anything that is contrary to the Scriptures? We should have a pessimistic view. We should proceed cautiously, if you will. Consider 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 3, when it says, "For the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but according to their own desires, because they have itching ears, they will heap on themselves teachers." So, yes, when we, again, just like with the first point up there, we need to be cautious and pessimistic when it comes to things that are contrary to sound doctrine. We don't want to have anything to do with those things. We don't want to have that creep in on us and take root, if you will. And that's often that's how those things get rooted, is in complacency. Is when you're not on guard for them, that's one that creeps in, and before you know it, it takes over. So yes, there are times in one's life that you should probably have a pessimistic view towards some things or some aspects of life, and especially anything that's contrary to the Scriptures or anything that would cause us to sin, we need to be pessimistic towards. So as we close out, we'll just look at some other tidbits of pearls of wisdom from famous authors or whatnot. Winston Churchill is quoted in saying, "A pessimist sees the difficulty in every opportunity. An optimist sees the opportunity in every difficulty." And I think I like that, and that's why I put that in there. And I think that rings true, especially when it comes to the work of the church. Instead of thinking that it's difficult to go out there and share the gospel with everybody, we need to really turn that around and really see that there's an opportunity in the difficulty and sharing with it everybody, and that realize that nothing worthwhile comes easy. And so I think there's some pearls of wisdom there that we can incorporate. Robert Louis Stevenson, a Scottish novelist and travel writer, he said, "Don't judge each day by the harvest you reap, but by the seeds that you plant." And I think, again, that's some pearls of wisdom that we could take away, especially when it comes to the planting of the gospel. So in closing, we define what optimism and pessimism is, and what that attitude is. And again, we want to kind of try to, if we do have a pessimistic view towards things, we want to kind of shift that away, and we want to realize that a Christian really should have an optimistic view on life, and that we shouldn't allow pessimism to hinder us from being a good Christian and doing the things that we ought to do as Christians. We need to realize that we evaluate some situations, that feelings and actions towards fellow, men and Christians need to be optimistic. We need to be optimistic towards our health, and that we need to be optimistic towards the work of the church, and we need to be optimistic through our journey and through our everyday lives. We need to be optimistic towards those things, and to look, and then for those times that could cause us to lead astray, that's when we need to be pessimistic. So that's a lesson. I hope that it's been a benefit to you, and hopefully, again, that's part of the series of, changing our mindset, if you will, how we view things. And so now we want to extend the invitation. This is God's plan of salvation. I think we're all familiar with this. If this is applicable to you, and if there's anything that the congregation can do on your behalf, whatever that may be, let it be known as we stand and sing the song that's been chosen.
The voice of the Savior.